by and large, young children are not good with money. If they have $10 in their pocket and they're at the grocery store and they're saving for a bike, and then they see the candy.
Yeah.
The candy will always supersede the bike because they don't have a long-term plan for what they're going to do with their money. They maybe think, I want to buy a bike, but when that delicious candy is in front of them, they just can't help it.
Difficult.
It's really difficult. So as we think about passing resources on, we want to make sure that we're passing them on wisely to the next generation.
Right.
And that next generation, they can be people or institutes. You don't want to pass on $20,000 to a 6-year-old who is not ready for it and can't handle it.
Right.
But we would hope that as they grow and as they mature, the possibility and the potential to handle resources grows with them. So as we think about passing on resources wisely to the next generation, what are some just outset things to consider, Spencer?
Well, we want to push back on where we perceive culture going here. And for some reason in our culture, the underlying assumption is that your estate plan is basically the following. If you have a spouse, everything goes to spouse. If you do not have a spouse, then everything goes to your children. If you have children, so you take your net worth, divide by the number of children, then pass on equally.
Right.
If you do not have a spouse, do not have kids, then it's your closest friendship or closest relative who receives all of those resources.
Yeah.
There's this idea that that's just the way things are done.
Yeah.
And so the number of times that we see people begin to deviate from that to take a different path that is actually their choice of how they align their wealth with those core values, sometimes which really isn't the same as some of those beneficiaries. And not to say that you disinherit beneficiaries,
right,
but that you do have a choice of what goes where and what timing that happens as well. And that's one of the things that we want to raise today.
Yeah. So as we think about today, and as we think about passing resources on wisely, we're really going to think about it in this paradigm of 3 questions. Who's getting the resources? How much is enough for them? And then are they ready for it?
Right.
So let's start off with this idea of who gets these resources. And I think one of the significant things to consider is ideally the next generation, whether it's people or institutes, they would desire your relationship more than your resources.
Right. So there's this idea that we want to deepen the relationship, and sometimes we can use resources now to help deepen that relationship through trips or through gifts or through being engaged with that next generation.
Yeah.
So we can have that influence now and not creating dependency.
No.
So there has to be some level of thought and reflection, wisdom, but being able to think about the generational pass on of resources that can happen over time and not just at death.
Yeah.
So we want to think about that. The other thing that we want to think about is for most folks, there are people outside of their family or institutions outside of their family that they also care about very deeply.
Yeah.
And so thinking about, okay, how do I parcel these different pieces out? Now there can be pushback from different parties, but I think this is the decision of each person who has these resources.
Right.
They've got to make a decision here. And so we want to, again, at first push back and say, just because the culture is moving along in this direction, this stream, doesn't mean that you have to float along with it there.
Right. Well, and I think, some of our clients get into situations where maybe there's still an ailing parent that needs consideration. And so if you take the normal path and it's like, well, everything's either going to go to my spouse or my kids.
Right.
But if you have a parent in need, we want to be able to think more broadly than just what the cultural water says.
Right. And sometimes that can even mean we're not pushing all resources to a spouse.
Yeah.
A spouse may be perfectly well taken care of. Spouses could come together and be able to say, well, actually, when the first one of us dies, let's push a certain amount of resources to this institution that we've loved.
Yeah.
Or let's actually push some resources out to the kids, or other people that are important to us, because there may be tax advantages in some different ways of thinking through those pieces. So we want to come back and say, not just in a situation where we're passing on resources to the next generation, downward to the next generation, but also even spousal. We've had circumstances where clients will set up particular accounts that will go in certain directions so that they can have the joy the survivor of seeing some of those resources used during his or her lifetime.
Right. That's good. So one of the other pieces to this, to thinking about who gets it, is the reality that money affects people.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, if there are character issues, money can amplify those character issues.
Right.
And so we really want to think about this, because we don't want to just pass on an abundance of resources to somebody that is going to maybe misuse those resources.
Right.
Now, we can't say what that end state is going to be, but we just want to ask the question of, how will this affect this next individual?
Right. And we think about that, and this is one of those other reasons why we would come back to, does it make sense to be able to pass some of these resources on earlier, is because you actually get some feedback. You get to see how they use the resources.
Right.
If you have $3 million that you pass on to the next generation, and you have 3 beneficiaries, down the next generation, it might make sense to start, parceling out gifts earlier if you have what you need, to be able to see, how are they using resources?
Yeah.
Is this in line with, what my hopes, would be? Or if not in line with your hopes, at least that it wouldn't be destructive to them. Because the last thing any of us wants to do as a parent or as a loved one is actually amplify character issues and destroy a son, daughter, friend, niece, nephew. We want to make sure that there's benefit, there.
Yeah.
Do no harm, at least with the estate plan,
Yeah. So the last consideration in this, who is going to receive the resources? We have a wise teacher that once said, never pass wealth without first passing wisdom. And I think this kind of goes back to that first point that we made, that the relationship is really critical. We want to invest in those people. We want to invest time and energy into those relationships.
Right.
So that we're passing wisdom, so that when they inherit resources, kind of like the reality that money affects people, well, if we've passed on wisdom and we've had that relational conversation of, hey, this is what you're getting, and it's because of these things, then ideally in that state, then they can use those resources wisely.
Right.
But we want to make sure that we are passing on wisdom to the next generation.
Right. Because even if we use some kind of structure like a trust, there's going to be difficulties in speaking beyond the grave. I mean, the number of times that we see assets that are used in trust for reasons that create dependency, or really are not aligned with, dad or mom's desire for wholeness and goodness to be in the child's life, in the heir's life. It's we have to recognize that there's some limitations there, and the better we can do in, as you said, Austin, building that relationship, doing our best to encourage wisdom, and then parceling that out over time to get a sense of how things are going, we can at least be more informed as we make decisions for the future.
So now that we've surfaced the question of who's getting the resources, we want to dive a little bit more deeply into how much is enough for that person or that institution. So Spencer, we start off with this statement that we heard before.
Right.
Because we love our children equally, we treat them differently.
Right.
And I think that's a really maybe a hard statement for people to wrestle with, but I think it's really good.
Right.
So what are some other considerations when we think about how much is enough for the next generation?
Well, we want to come back to an openness of how we pass things on. Yeah. And, this can be as creative as every family wants to make it,
right?
Really.
Right.
Because, again, if we're desiring really wholeness for that next generation, we look at and see, where are they along that journey? Yeah. So for one example might be, Emily and I, my wife and I have been in a season where we're raising kiddos. Well, we've been really gifted that we have both sides of our families that are willing to be able to help us with childcare, either consistently on a week-to-week basis, or taking trips, or doing those kinds of things. Yeah. Well, if we didn't have that, but we had maybe distant family, them being able to help with childcare, with the expense of that would really bless the family, help, to bless the marriage, all kinds of different pieces of that. Now, one could say, well, does that create dependency? Well, you're not going to have kids under the roof forever, and if you can shepherd that season, in a way where you're really investing in them, but also investing in each other,
Right.
that can have tremendous benefits.
Yeah.
So, it could be that we have a season where the next generation is going back to school and needs some help, with some of those expenses, or needs some help with a professional designation, or whatever it might be. There's all kinds of different directions where, resources could be utilized in the present time. That there certainly is a risk that there could create some expectancy that gifts continue, or some dependency. But in a loving and open relationship, that's one of the risks that we take as we have those conversations sometimes, and that can actually deepen relationships if we have some level of openness about where we're at financially, and how we can love each other well, in the midst of that.
Right. So as we think about passing on resources, both currently and in the future at passing, here are just some questions that we're going to put up on the screen that may be helpful to consider. So one is, what would those people or institutions do with the resources that I would give them? Maybe what are their current needs and desires, and can I help meet those needs now? What are future needs that they may have? So consider those future needs when you're thinking about how much to pass along. How could passing along these resources impact their current and future tax situation? If you've got $1 million IRA and you've got one heir, then over the next 10 years, as it currently stands, they're going to have to take out distributions. And if you're adding $100,000 or more to what they need to take out every year, that could significantly impact their tax situation. So maybe have that consideration. And then, would giving them significant resources hinder their ability to grow and develop personally? We've surfaced that one a few times, but I think it's important to consider, what is that growth? Where are we hoping for that next generation to be? So what are maybe some other things, if you've got any, Spencer, when we think about how much is enough for the next generation?
Well, I think we talked about individuals. We also think about institutions. Institutions need resources at different times. Sometimes it's more critical. There are periods where we may feel like we really want to increase our level of giving, in a certain time period. So we might take out resources to be able to make those gifts. One of the things that we surface with clients is that they can make, by the time they're age 70 and a half, they can make qualified charitable distributions each year up to $100,000 per person. Well, you may say, okay, well, I'm 80 years old and I want to be able to make an extra big gift to this institution this year, and I have the resources to do it. Wonderful. Make that extra gift that goes above and beyond your required minimum distribution, and do some of that living and giving right now, rather than opposed to just saying, well, I'm going to wait until I pass away to ultimately pass this set of resources to this institution. That can be a fine approach, but oftentimes if you make that gift earlier, you can see with joy, what they're able to do with those resources, or you see that they didn't manage them well, and you don't want to leave them anything more, at your passing there. So, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be that joyful circumstance. And then, at least the 1 time out of 10, you have the cautionary tale of, well, I know where I'm not going to pass on any more resources, there. But it allows you to make decisions in sequence that really, on the balance, I think can be tremendously helpful as being a good steward.
All right, so we've talked about who is the next person to get the resources, how much is enough for them. We want to just briefly talk about, are they ready for it? We've kind of already hit on this a few times. The reality is that money can affect people. And so we want to make sure that we're passing resources on to give the next generation the best chance for success. We don't want to deviate their plan of life so significantly. But we want to consider, there's 2 other considerations with this. Is, are they emotionally ready? And then, are they physically ready? Well, some children or people with special needs are going to have physical limitations that may need trust documents, that may need trust established to help them out. So really, as you think about, are they ready for it, consider emotional readiness, but also physical readiness. Is there anything else you would touch on there, Spencer, with?
No, just the idea again that taking care of them is something that every family is different. You can talk with different people that are in kind of your friend group or family. But ultimately, it's your choice.
Yeah.
And having the courage to be able to say, well, I think that this is going to be the best that I can do to care for and love the people and institutions that are in my life, to be able to be courageous, in that. And if you need to go a little different path than some of the others around you, if that's appropriate.
Yeah. So as we close out today, a couple of things that we want to encourage you with are have conversations. Have conversations with those that will receive resources. Maybe try to figure out, are there ways to accelerate that? Accelerate it in currently. Also, review your beneficiary designations. If you haven't looked at it, if maybe you set your IRA up 30 years ago and haven't looked at who the beneficiaries are, it's probably wise to review those every couple of years. And again, just having honest conversations. If you're going to start taking some of the resources that you have and pushing them to charity, but the next generation is expecting those, it could create tension and turmoil at your passing. And you don't want that. So have those honest conversations, build those relationships with those folks so that there's not a surprise at the end of your life. You want to pass things on well and wisely. So be willing to have hard conversations, be willing to invest in those relationships. So with that, we hope you enjoy this video and we'll see you again soon.
Take care.
This content was provided by Retirement Planning Services. We're in Knoxville, Tennessee, and you can visit our website at www.seriousretirement.com. The information in this recording is intended for general educational and informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advisory, financial planning, legal, tax, or other professional advice based on your specific situation. Please consult with your professional advisor before taking any action based on its contents.